It's very, I guess I'm not the last shiur, but it's very dangerous to be the person between you and your Bein Hazmanim, you know. It's kind of but hopefully we'll survive. Okay, so Baruch Hashem, I think we're going to finish the Perek, so we're in a very logical place. Not quite finished the Sefer, but we're approaching it. We are looking at Perek Shmini of the Talmud Devorah, and Perek Shmini, you'll recall, covers 3 spheros: Netzach, Hod, Yesod, and the issue is, what can I do to emulate the qualities of those spheros so that the light of those spheros will shine on me and on the world as a whole? So if you recall the general Mahalach, for most of the analysis, except for just one particular rule, the Ramak treats Netzach and Hod the same. He treats them as either 2 students or 2 pillars, 2 legs. And he does not differentiate except in one narrow context. And you'll recall that the double imagery that he has for Netzach and Hod is Netzach and Hod are described as the legs or the thighs that carry the torso of Tiferes. And in that connection, they are the machzikei Torah, right? Tiferes is Torah. The thighs support the body. They are machzikei Torah. And therefore, the way you emulate Netzach and Hod is by being a supporter of Torah. So it's not talking about learning per se, but supporting Torah. And that is both by financial, that is by creating the environment of a Beis Medrash or the like, and by psychologically being machshiv people who are learning Torah so they feel they're doing something worthwhile, right? So that's the image of Netzach and Hod as machzikei Torah. And you'll remember I shared with you the word from the Zohar that says that this is why Yaakov was smitten on the thigh, because the support of Torah is going to be weak. The angel of Esav could not take away Torah from Am Yisrael. There will be people who will learn Torah even in abject poverty. But the financial, plus the psychological, even more so maybe, support of Torah is always going to be precarious and vulnerable. That is why Yaakov is limping on the thigh. So that is the first imagery of Netzach and Hod as the pillars or the thighs or the legs that are supporting the Tiferes of Torah. The second imagery is that Netzach and Hod are called Limudei Hashem. They learn from Hashem, meaning they are called the Talmidim of Tiferes, because they're Makabel, a Shefa from Tiferes. And therefore, the way you emulate Netzach and Hod in that way is to be a lomed mikol adam, willing to learn from everybody. And the concept here would be that everybody has a chelik of emes. You open yourself up to be makabel from everybody. Now that obviously is connected to humility, but it's really a separate quality in some ways. It's kind of an openness to reevaluate your position. Again, I was reading, I mentioned a number of times already. So now I have competition. I think my favorite Gedolim biography is Rav David Feinstein. I think so. But I have to say that the one about my Rebbe, Rav Klesky, which I got later, or someone gave it to me later, is up there simply because, number one, he was my Rebbe, and I know a lot of the stories firsthand. So I'm not sure. So I'm debating. But from your perspective, both are very worthwhile. And in there was talking about the fact that a bacher was arguing with him over pshat, and they were arguing like for 45 minutes. And at some point, and this happens sometimes, maybe you've experienced it, their positions were actually reversed. In the middle of a complicated discussion, the Talmud starts saying what the Rebbe was saying, and the Rebbe starts saying what the Talmud was saying. And at some point, the Talmud said to the Rebbe, "Rebbe, I was trying to tell you this for 45 minutes." And the Rebbe said, "Yeah, well, you're right. That's why I'm saying it." So the idea of switching around, being Maida emes, being flexible and humble enough to kind of see the emes coming from the other side. The Gemara gives an example that Torah is compared to fire, or light. Kiner mitzvah. Every mitzvah is a candle. The Torah ohr. The Torah is a light, a pasuk in Mishlei. So the Gemara compares it. The Gemara seems to understand that a light is the way you light a candle. A big candle can be lit from the smallest match. You can take a little match or a little coal, and you can light a gigantic candle, gigantic light. So that's Torah as well. A katan can be madlik a gadol, meaning to say that even a person who knows much, much less maybe than the Rebbe or the Talmid Chacham can still be a source of enlightenment to the Talmid Chacham, because that's the comparison to candle. A katan is madlik es a gadol. So the famous statement that I've learned much from my Rebbes and even more from my Chaverim, and I've learned most from my Talmud, is understood in a lot of ways. One way is, the simple pshat actually is, in the process of teaching, a lot of things get clear to you. Okay, so the Mela I learned from my Talmidim, because when I teach, I have to explain it. But the Ramak seems to say there's another aspect. It's not just I gain from my Talmidim because I teach them, although that's true, but I gain from my Talmidim because I also learn from them. You see, that's the katan madlik es hagadol. The Gemara has an interesting ma'aseh in Bava Metzia. It's coming up in Daf Yomi. Very, very tragic story. Everyone knows the story of Rav Yochanan and Reish Lakish, right? Rav Yochanan was one of the greatest of the Amoraim. Reish Lakish was a highway robber, essentially. And at one point, he accosted Rav Yochanan, was going to either rob him or even kill him, perhaps. And Rav Yochanan told him, if you devote your strength to Torah learning, you will marry my sister, who's even more beautiful than I. Rav Yochanan was an extraordinarily beautiful person, and my sister is even better. So this is clearly Shalom Lishma, but Reish Lakish decided to learn, and he became what's called a Talmid Chaver. He was a Talmud, but he was also a colleague, kind of an equal, that they would argue together. And at one point, Reish Lakish died. And Rav Yochanan, as you would expect, was heartbroken. In fact, what's even worse is it may have been connected to Rav Yochanan cursing him on something. You know, it's a very, very sad story that something got out of control and it released certain forces. So Rav Yochanan actually felt responsible for Reish Lakish's death. And they tried to replace Reish Lakish with another person, because Reish Lakish's minhag was, every time Rav Yochanan said something, Reish Lakish would ask him 24 questions, 24 contradictions. And they replaced him with another person who every time Rav Yochanan said something, he brought him 24 proofs that he was right. And Rav Yochanan started crying, and he said, where is Reish Lakish? Where is Reish Lakish? So they said, well, what are you complaining about? Okay, it's a personal loss, but Reish Lakish was driving you crazy. Every time he said something, he was giving you 24 reasons that you're wrong. And now we have somebody, every time you say something, he gives you 24 reasons that you're right. You want to like this even better. So Rav Yochanan said, I don't need somebody to tell me I'm right. If I didn't think I was right, I wouldn't say it. But when Reish Lakish challenged me, so what happened therefore was I had to re-examine, I had to re-explain. Sometimes if I was wrong, I changed my mind. If I was right, I understood much better why I was right in terms of answering these questions. So he said, I actually need not a yes man. I actually need someone that would ask all of these questions. Right? So this is called Lomed Mikol Adam, meaning the Rebbe is flexible, adaptable, humble enough to kind of receive even from someone that one might regard, I put in quotation marks, his inferior. I mean, not inferior is not the right word, but that kind of in the hierarchy of things. And that's Lomed Mikol Adam, and that too is the midah of Netzach and Hod, which become Limudei Hashem. So again, Netzach and Hod have two identities. They are supporters of Torah, and they are Talmidim of Torah. And therefore, when I become a Lomed Mikol Adam, meaning I'm willing to be a Talmud from everybody, I am linking myself to Netzach and Hod. This probably was one of the best possible ads that you could have for a sefer. When the Art Scroll put out the Hebrew, we call the Schattenstein, the Hebrew Art Scroll on Shas. So they had a picture of Rebbe Yashiv going through it. And that's pretty good. Even the Gadol HaDor, uses our Hebrew product, at least. And the emes is, this was not a promotional gimmick. Rebbe Yashiv, would look at Art Scroll sometimes. So again, lucky he's not in the center. But he would look at Art Scroll sometimes to see if there were any ha'oras, because he said, listen, these are people who are shakua in the sugya, young kailol people, and maybe they came up with something. A person who has such a love of Torah that he would explore like every possible corner. Maybe he came up with something. Maybe this Avrech, 75 years younger than Rebbe Yashiv, 80 years younger, whatever, may have come up with some observation that eluded him and the like. In fact, Rebbe Yashiv had such a hakara satay for any insight in Torah. Legend has it, I'm not sure it's true, that you see now all the wall posters and even the loudspeakers, they always want to ban the internet. A life without internet, a life without, et cetera, et cetera. So at one point, Rebbe Yashiv was asked to sign a letter just prohibiting the use of the internet. Except for business or whatever it is, can't use the internet. And the fact is, he never signed such a letter. That we know. But the legend is, or the explanation is, because one time, somehow somebody found a source on the internet that Rebbe Yashiv was not aware of. A source in a sefer. And Rebbe Yashiv felt he had akara satayv to the search engines that came up with some little aspect of Torah that he was not aware of. He said he could not answer it. Like the Gemara says, the well that you drink from, don't spit into. So he felt a certain akara satayv, and his shita was, which is, the common sense shita, is that this is a tool that can be used for very bad things, and it can be used for good things. He says you don't answer the tool, you try to answer the behaviors that are associated with the tool, like driving, right? A car is a very, very dangerous thing. A car kills people, and many people are killed. On the other hand, a car or a bus or whatever you're using is a very major convenience. So you don't answer cars, you don't answer buses. You try to make people better drivers. So Rebbe Yashiv himself did not want to answer the internet because he had this hakara satayv, because it once was megala something to him that he'd either forgotten or somehow was not aware of. Right? So that's the bechina of lo made mikol adam. Now, then the Ramak goes into a certain digression, and I think I had left you with a question, and I still don't have a great mahalach on it. He said these two ideas. One is that Netzach and Hod are the legs, the supports, and the other is Netzach and Hod are the Talmidim. This is a common denominator to both Netzach and Hod. This is not differentiating Netzach and Hod. But he then says that Netzach is to the right, is the right leg, and Hod is the left leg. So he suggests that Netzach is connected to Torah shebichsav, which is to the right, and Hod is connected to Torah shebal peh. And again, if you imagine the line here, you'll see that Chesed and Netzach are in the same direction, the same axis, the same vertical axis. Chesed is the right arm, Netzach is the right leg. So therefore, Torah shebichsav is connected to Chesed. Torah shebal peh, which is Hod, which is in the same vertical axis as Devorah, is connected to Devorah. So when you learn Torah shebichsav, you're more connected to Netzach, which is connected to Chesed. When you learn Torah shebal peh, you're more connected to Hod, which is connected to Devorah. Now this is the only place in the entire Talmud Devorah where he suggests a distinction between Netzach and Hod. And then he says, when you learn Gemara, Gemara is balul from Torah shebichsav and Torah shebal peh, and therefore you're drawing from both equally. In fact, just as a little aside, this is the famous Shita of Rabbeinu Tam. The Gemara says in Avodah Zarah, and the Rambam paskins this way, lahalacha, that a person should divide his Torah learning into 3 sections. Apparently 3 equal sections. A third of Tanakh, Torah Shebechsav, a third of in Torah Shebal Peh, and a third in Gemara, or Talmud. Now, let's just stop there, just as a matter of definition. What is Torah Shebal Peh versus Talmud? I mean, Talmud is Torah Shebal Peh, right? So the answer is Torah Shebal Peh would more or less correspond to specific halachas. You're either learning halacha, or maybe you're learning Mishnah, but you're not going into the depth of understanding the reason. So a third is Tanakh, a third is Mishnah halacha, and a third is trying to understand things in a deeper way that we would call Talmud. It's a little confusing because even in our Talmud we have Bekias, but Talmud seems to be understood as a more in-depth type of learning. In fact, maybe Bekias Gemara, it's not clear, might be subsumed under Torah Shebal Peh. It's not clear. Torah Shebal Peh clearly includes Mishnah and Halacha. It may include superficial Gemara. So then you have a shaila, in other words. Is the category of Talmud only Eon, or does the category of Talmud include Bekias? Where would you put Bekias Gemara? I don't know. But it says you divide your Torah learning into 3. The Rambam then says, Bameh Devorah Mamurim, when do I divide my learning into 3? B'tchilas limuda, when I'm still trying to master the basic things. But once I've mastered Tanakh, once I've mastered, let's say, Mishnayos, I should spend my whole time in Eon, except for the need for periodic review. But I don't have to spend 1/3 of my time on Tanakh and 1/3 of my time on Mishnah. Okay. Well, I think it's realistic to say that all of us are really b'tchilas limuda, right? We haven't graduated to the notion of mastering the other ones. So the big question is, why don't we do this? Why don't we divide our learning into 3? The Gemara says, and the Rambam so paskins, that you divide your learning into 3 until you've mastered Tanakh and Mishnayos. Well, one answer might be, we ought to do that. Yeah, okay. There's a lot of things we ought to be doing that we're not doing. But there is a famous, maybe even infamous, Shita of Rabbeinu Tam, that already in Rabbeinu Tam's time, in Rashi's time, in the 1200s, they were not doing this. They were doing mainly Gemara. And Rabbeinu Tam says, when you learn our Gemara, you're yotzei all 3 elements, because in our Gemara there is Psukim, in our Gemara there is Mishnah, and in our Gemara there is Talmud, and therefore you are yotzei everything by Gemara. And he even says, B'derech Drush, that's why the Talmud Bavli is called Bavli, not because it was written in Babylonia, which is certainly the reason, but because it's balul. It's a mix of all of the different components of Torah. So Rabbeinu Tam was trying to give what you might call a limud zechus, a partial defense for a practice that was against the Talmud, against the Gemara, already as early as the 1200s, and that was the abandonment of systematic study of Nach in large circles. And apparently Gemara had taken central place, and Rabbeinu Tam was struggling with the fact that this seems to contradict the ruling of the Gemara itself, and he came up with this teretz that one is yotzei with Gemara. Yeah.
According to Refinement and Yesod, would it then be better to learn nothing but Hasidus, because then you're even getting Kabbalah into the mix?
Well, yeah. Well, I hear what you're saying. You could take it to a further and further extent. Now, the issue of Nach later, though, got complicated by another factor. So we already see the beginning of this movement in the time of the Rishonim, Rashi, Rabbeinu Tam, even though, of course, Rashi himself wrote a Perush ala Torah. And that is, if you fast forward to the 18th and 19th century, when you have the Haskala movement, the so-called Jewish Enlightenment. Now, the Jewish Enlightenment is actually it's a very complicated movement. First of all, it varied from country to country. The Haskala in Germany was not the same as the Haskala in Galicia, Poland. It was not the same as Russia. It took different forms. Also, the individual maskilim were very different. There were maskilim who were from Talmidei Chachamim, who believed in expanding their horizons by secular wisdoms, but they were from, right? Although they were suspect because they were more modern than the prevailing culture. And then you had other maskilim who were basically apikorsim. They wanted to throw away Torah and mitzvahs, and they said it's holding back progress, and we're not becoming citizens of the world, etc. There were maskilim who only wanted to write and speak in Hebrew, and there were maskilim who did their stuff in Yiddish, and there were maskilim who rejected Hebrew and Yiddish, and they wanted to only write in German or Russian. So it's not a one-size-fits-all, meaning sometimes we use maskilim. Everybody who was a maskil was a Rosh Gomer. I mean, not true. There were maskilim who were Talmidei Chachamim who were a little controversial because they took certain positions on modernity, modern Orthodox, or whatever they would be called today, and the like. But one of the characteristics of at least the left-wing maskil was a certain disdain for Talmud, because remember that a lot of Haskala was, we want to be citizens of the world, we want to be refined, we want to be cultured, we want to be able to go into Parisian, rooms, dining rooms, etc. And they thought about the poor yeshiva bachrim in rags who were sitting over, doing Gemara hour after hour after hour, day after day, year after year. And they thought they had to escape from that. They had to be cultured people and the like. So they had a certain disdain for Gemara, for rabbinics. So what did they embrace? Like the Karaites, they embraced the learning of Nach. So many of the maskilim focused only on the Bible. They didn't want to focus on the Gemara or the Medrash. So unfortunately, our own Tanakh got guilty by association, meaning to say, ad kedei kach, that learning Nach got associated with the Haskala. So if you were in a yeshiva like Slobodka and you pulled a Nach off the shelf, they always had Nach on the shelves, they had to give lip service to that. But if you pulled a Nach off the shelf, you might get reported as, I think this guy's a maskil. Let's check what other suspect books he's reading in his room and the like. You know what they say, today Sefer Malachim, tomorrow Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, it's going to go it's going to go worse and worse and the like. So this is not really a joke. In other words, Nach actually got tainted as an accusation of Haskala, And to some degree that even exists today, but I do want to say that Baruch Hashem, it's interesting that even though the dairis get lower and lower and lower, sometimes HaKadosh Baruch Hu allows later doros to have certain accomplishments that earlier doros did not have. And you can actually see a certain reinvigoration of Tanakh study among Bnei Yeshiva. If you look, for example, there are many Svarim coming out on Nach, kind of from a Haredi standpoint, meaning the difference is Haredi books on Nach are very, very heavily invested, not only in the classic Meforshim, but in the Chazals, in the Gemaras, in the Midrashim, and in the halachic aspects, right? Because a lot of times you read things in Nach that don't seem to fit the halacha as we know it. So a lot of the Meforshim didn't bother with that. They didn't bother they didn't bother to integrate the halachos with whatever it says in the Psukim. But the neo-Haredi Tanakh literature is very, very concerned with the inyanim of halacha. But whether that's the appropriate derech or not is another question. But one thing for sure is that Nach is much, much more learned in the yeshiva Haredi Kolo world than it had been for many, many decades. So in a sense, it's kind of a shtickle mitzvah that HaKadosh Baruch Hu allowed the later generations to reclaim. And that's a very good thing. Yerushalmi is similar, for a different reason. The Yerushalmi had been totally ignored. Now with Art Scroll and other things, Yerushalmi is now also being learned in wider and wider circles than it had previously been done. Okay, so I'm bringing this up just as, again, this was a digression, but the concept is, once again, that Netzach to the right is mechuber to Chesed, which is Torah Shebechsav. Hod to the left is mechuber to Gevura, which is Torah Shebal Peh. And Gemara, like Rabbeinu Tam said, the Ramak uses Kemat the same lashon, although not for the purpose that Rabbeinu Tam uses it, is Bolo Mishneim. It is a mix of both Torah Shebechsav and Torah Shebal Peh. Now, why would it be the case, just in terms of understanding the imagery, why would it be the case that Torah Shebechsav would be Chesed Mitzad Yamin? So the answer actually is very simple in some ways, and that is Torah Shebechsav was given to us by God. This is what God gave us. Now, Torah Shebal Peh, it's true that Hashem gave Moshe oral directives, but as we've said many, many times, the development and application of Torah Shebechsav, of Torah Shebal Peh, is a function of human effort. So there's a Gevura. God withheld something to leave it to us to explicate. So Torah Shebechsav is what God gave us. Torah Shebal Peh is what we need to both transmit and uncover and discover and explicate and explain. God withheld, so to speak, the final answers, leaving it to machlokas and discussion. So in that way, we say that Torah Shebechsav is Netzach, Chesed, Torah Shebal Peh is Gevura, Hod. But I did mention, I left you with a question, and the truth of the matter is I don't really have a good answer, that you actually find an opposite teaching. I think I mentioned that the Mekubalim say that one should not recite psukim at night. Some Mekubalim would not say Tehillim at night. They would not do Shnayim Mikra at night. The exception would be Friday night, Shabbos night. They would do it because all 24 hours or 25 hours of Shabbos are called daylight hours, meaning ohr. There's a manim of ohr. But the reason why on a regular night, also after Chatzais is mutter. After Chatzais is already the start of day. Not halachically, but Kabbalistically. Kabbalistically and secularly, interestingly enough, right? The new day begins midnight. It's important to know, read your airline tickets very carefully. It happened to me more than once. This idea of, right, when the flight is leaving 12:45 a.m. Wednesday night. So a simple Pashida person reads 12:45 a.m. Wednesday night. I wait until Wednesday, and I take the plane at 12:45. Problem is, after midnight, it's Thursday night. So 12:45 Wednesday night is Tuesday night, late Tuesday night, because it becomes Wednesday, right? So I remember showing up for a plane to get back to Israel, and the plane had left 24 hours before because I misread the Wednesday night, Thursday night type of thing. But in Kabbalah, it's the same thing. By the Mekubalim, the day begins from Chatzais. And that's why the Isser that Mekubalim have of don't read psukim at night does not apply once it's past Chatzos. Past Chatzos is already Eis Ratzon. In fact, that's why Tikkun Chatzos. That's why it was a Zman to pray for the rebuilding of the Beis HaMikdash. It was a Zman of Rachamim. Actually, that actually explains why Slichos can be said as early as Chatzos, because Slichos are supposed to be morning prayers, not night prayers. but after chatzais can have a din of yaim. That's why there's a very serious shaila in some neighborhoods. I don't know if they do it here, but in America sometimes they want to do slichos after Ma'ariv. They want to do slichos 8 o'clock at night or something. That's much more questionable because slichos are makusher to or hayom, and chatzos is already called or hayom. So, but be it as it may, unless it's Friday night or after chatzos, the Mekubalim do not recite psukim at night. The reason is, they say, because night is a time of din, a time of gevura, a time of divine concealment. And Torah shebichsav is connected to gevura and concealment of the divine, because you don't understand it. Therefore, you don't want to add gasoline to the fire. You don't want to be mosif gevura in a time of gevura. So, I don't know. I'll try to look into this. I didn't have time. You see the problem here. The Ramak actually says Torah shebichsav is the bechina of chesed, because it's Netzach on the right, and yet the Mekubalim who say don't read psukim at night are bedafka looking at Torah shebichsav as gevura, and you don't want to be meisif gevura and gevura in a time of Hester Panim. Yeah.
Do both dins flip? Do they say that you dafka can read, Torah Shabbat at night because it becomes mercy, or is it just the Torah Shabbat that's very?
So it's interesting. It is brought down, and on one level there is a consistency because it says some say you shouldn't learn Mishnah at night either. So that's still preserving the Mishnah as a midas hadin. So it's not a total flip. It's like both Torah shebichsav and Mishnah. So Gemara you can learn, Gemara and Kabbalah you can learn at night because they're rachamim, but Mishnah is also connected to the strict din. That's why some Mekubalim, the Tikkun Leil Shavuos, which I guess most people in yeshiva don't do, but the Tikkun Leil Shavuos is actually a curriculum of what you should learn Shavuos night. It's like the beginning and end of every parsha, the beginning and end of every sefer of Tanakh, the beginning and end of the Sidrei Mishnayos. So you kind of finish the Torah, finish the Mishnah, etc. But there are some Mekubalim. It's interesting. They say the psukim. I'm trying to figure out what they're working with. They say the psukim. Oh, actually, that actually fits the Ramak. They say the psukim, and they don't say the Mishnah. Yeah, that fits the Ramak's paradigm. In other words, they say the psukim. That fits the Ramak's paradigm. The Torah shebichsav is Netzach, Chesed, but they don't say the Mishnayos because that's din. Yeah, that actually fits the Ramak, but it doesn't fit the general Kabbalah of the Ari. So I'm going to see if there's a machlokas here, or there are different dimensions of chesed and din that applies. In some ways it's chesed, some ways it's gevura. But that's a ha'ara to keep in mind. Okay, now the final point, I don't know if I'll finish it, but just to almost finish it, is so we did Netzach Hod, we then go to Yesod. Remember, this whole paragraph is Netzach Hod, Yesod. Remember the imagery in the human body. Netzach is the right leg. Yesod is the left. Hod is the left leg. Yesod is the male organ, and since Yesod is the sixth of the Zeir Anpin, the small face, it is the Yesod that links up with Malchus in what looks like a sexual union, and that brings the Shefa of Bracha into the world via the Chibur of the Zeir Anpin and Malchus, which is also L'Shem Yichud, Kudsha Berichu Ushechin Te. So here he just makes the following point, that the way you imitate Yesod is connected to Shmiras Habris, because essentially the Yesod is viewed as a conveyor of this divine energy into Malchus. And that's why it's described as a bow, like a bow shoots an arrow. Yesod kind of infuses Malchus with Shefa. And the same way that Yesod only has one target. The only target of Yesod is Malchus. The Kayach doesn't go anywhere else. Either Yesod functions or doesn't function, but it never dissipates. It's Koach beyond Malchus. So too, the lesson for a person is to be Shomer es Habris, that his Zera, that he uses to be Mashpia and create life, should only go to the properly designated target, which would be his wife in the context of marriage, when she is not a Nida, and therefore this creates Zehirus of what is called the Shmiras Habris. And in this connection, he talks a little bit about the importance of avoiding Nivul Peh. Now, Nivul Peh, talk about profanity, obscenity, but the question is, it's interesting, it doesn't really have an absolute definition. I mean, I don't want to give you any graphic examples, that wouldn't be appropriate, but you make a list of what are called swear words or profanities, and it's not clear exactly if they all fall under Nivul Peh. The Ramak seems to use a definition of Nivul Peh is terms that have sexual connotations, which means when you talk about excretory connotations, certainly it's not refined just to talk about things like that, but it may not be Nichlal and Nivul Peh. Nivul Peh are words that are describing sexual activities. Okay? So the Ramak points out that one of the damages of Nivul Peh is that it implants certain mindsets, certain fantasies, certain images in a person's mind, and that could eventually come to violating Shmiras Habris. Again, this is an interesting point that it's not so simple. Meaning, the Ramak seems to say, I mean, let's take pornography. That's not Nivul Peh, that's watching things. So there's a big debate in the secular world. Is there anything wrong with pornography? What's wrong with pornography? It's a victimless crime. A guy sits around and he watches stuff. What's the big deal? So there are two ways of understanding why is it a big deal. One way of understanding it is that the actual contamination of your mind with images is besmirching your neshama, meaning it's not relevant if it'll translate into bad behavior. See, society is assuming if it's not going to result in rape or murder, it's fine. We could say no. Certain things are wrong because they taint your heart and your emotions and your feelings and your mind. So that's answer number one. Answer number two, the Ramak says here, is that these types of averos in speech or in istaklos are in fact likely to result in violations, not necessarily rape or murder, but even things that society may not consider a violation, like hotzas zera levatala. So you can declare, and the truth is it's both ideas. Is the problem I'm tainting my thought? Or is the problem that this will culminate in serious averos? The truth is both are right. I mean, they're not exclusive ideas. But here, the Ramak is focusing on Shmiras Habris, that Histaklos and Nivul Peh will all often be Gair Motzas Zera Levatala, and that disconnects you from Yesod, because Yesod is analogized to a keshes, a bow, that only directs its arrows to one target. So too I must direct the arrow only to one target, a proper target. And when I do that, I am connected to Yesod, which will allow Yesod to bring bracha into the world by its connection to Malchus. Okay, so that's the end of Perek Shmini. So it's interesting, we just have 2 prakim left. As I say, we're going a little faster. So after Pesach, we will do Perek Tishi, which is Malchus. And then Perek Asiri is a very interesting Perek in which he takes you through a day, right? how does a Makobo look at the day? Because the different parts of the day and night are ruled by different spheros. And therefore, there are certain times of the day you connect to Gevurah, certain times you connect to Tiferet. So he wants to take you through a 24-hour Meyes Lies in terms of living with the spheres. Yeah, you want to say?
I might have mentioned this before, but in Kabbalah, why not, at night, why not do, why can't we say that doing Torah B'Ksana and Torah Shabbat Peh will have the Devorah sweetened by the Haskala?
So I should have mentioned this. Yeah, I think I did mention it before. In fact, many Paiskim say la halacha that even if you're machmer not to do mikra at night, if you do it with a peirush like Rashi, it's mutter, because Rashi brings in the Torah Shebal Peh into the Torah Shebichsav. So in point of fact, it may depend. If you're doing Shnayim mikra with Unkelis, maybe not. But if you're doing Shnayim, I don't know, that's a Shaila thing. But Shnayim mikra with Rashi is bringing in Torah Shebal Peh, so that would be considered mutter, and you'd be allowed to do that. Okay, well, wish you all a Chag Kosher v'Sameach, and may it be a Zman of Yeshua and Geula for all of Klal Yisrael.
Thank you for listening to this ohr production. To find out more and to partner in our mission, please visit ohr.edu.